Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Peter. And it's really wonderful to hear you and be in the same room with you again because it's been way too long.
Yes, it has.
Uh yeah. And I know some of you in the audience as well. It's hello, it's lovely to hear you guys too. Um so first of all, I really want to thank the Diocese of talking the Diocese of Toronto and the Social Justice and Advocacy Committee for inviting me to do this workshop. I'm incredibly honored. It's what a wonderful I'm what a wonderful honor, and I'm rather humbled to have been asked to do it because I say right up that in spite of being a you know doing my PhD in this stuff. I do not consider myself an expert at all. Uh, you know, I live it. I follow people who live it on Twitter, but I feel like there are people who are far deeper experts than me. Um, and particularly, I think I feel that way because I know that I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here, but because I know that I'm relatively privileged, and so there's people who have much more intense training in the school of lived experience than I do, if I can put it that way. um just a couple of things. um Peter and Melissa have graciously volunteered to admit people for me because the waiting room is kind of a pain. Also, they have agreed to monitor the chat because, oops, thank for reminding myself, I'm going to be working with the chat muted because otherwise, every time anyone posts something, my screen reader will jabber at me, and that will be really distracting while I'm trying to talk and will cause me to derail. So they will be monitoring the chat and sort of flagging it when people have questions or things they want to mention. Also, I had a slide presentation, but the screen share decided that it didn't feel like cooperating. So sadly, that's not going to work. However, I'm going to send it um, along with the sort of resources for further follow up reading, perusing, Twitter following. I'm going to be sending that stuff to Elin Goulden um, later after the day ends, so that she can send that out to all of you guys. Slide presentation doesn't the slideshow doesn't include anything I'm not going to cover verbally. It's just a kind of a Cole's note summary of what I will be talking about in case it's helpful for people to sort of have a visual summary of it as well as my talk. So that's sort of all the housekeeping stuff. Bear with me for a moment while I mute the chat so that my screen reader won't yammer at me every 5 seconds. What? Oh. There we go. Okay, there we go. So basically, how I want to do this is to spend some time. I haven't timed this, so I'm not exactly sure how much of the session it'll take, but spend some time sort of setting some context and then open up the floor for discussion to think about how we can apply some of these things sort of in our own context, in our own parishes, in our own parish life, our own political life, our own sort of local activities. Because, you know, spiritual, but also very practical because this is a social justice and advocacy workshop. So it seems like they're, you know, action is a component of what we want to do here, figuring out ways we can take action. And also, I find I always feel better when I feel like there's something I can actually do about an issue instead of just brooding on how awful things are. I mean, it's, not always, not always much. It sometimes feels like a drop in the bucket, but at least you can do something as opposed to just feeling powerless. So I think that's important to sort of, yeah, spend some time talking about how we can apply this stuff. And before I sort of begin talking about the sort of concrete stuff, because this is an Anglican church, because this is a church conference, and we're thinking about the spiritual as well as the practical. I wanted to start off with a bit of a reflection. Okay, it's only 1:11. I'll be checking the clock on my phone every now and then just to make sure how I'm doing for time, but it's only 1:11, so okay, I'm good. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of a reflection to sort of put us in the right headspace, I guess I would say. And I had hoped to have the actual scriptural passage available. I'm sorry, I don't. Partly because I was racking my brains for an appropriate sort of prayer or scriptural passage, and an appropriate one didn't actually occur to me until late last night. And of course, when it did, I went, well, why didn't that occur to me sooner? But unfortunately, it didn't. And it's interesting because at least if Google is anything to go by, it seems to be a kind of an overlooked story in the Gospels. I could not find, you know, I could not find it blasted well anywhere. And I find that really interesting. And if someone knows their Bible really well and can actually sort of maybe put in the chat where this is, please do. Because I'm thinking of a particular story in my mind. It's linked to the wedding at Cana, but don't quote me on that. Um, and it's one of those stories in the Gospels that features a crippled girl, a crippled woman, a woman who can't walk. And the story implies that it's congenital, that she's been that way all her life. And Jesus goes in and spends some time with her. And the story does not tell us what Jesus said or did. We don't know. But she emerges from that interaction profoundly joyful. She emerges with this profound joy. And I would go so far as to say hope, but definitely like profound joy and sense of the love and and sense of the love of God. But here's, to me, is the really interesting thing about this story. It's not a miracle story in the conventional sense. She's not cured. She doesn't Jesus doesn't do something and make her miraculously able to walk again. She's still disabled. And this particular story has always intrigued me because, as far as I know, it's the only such story. If someone who knows their Bible better than I do, please correct me on this if I'm incorrect. But as far as I know, it's the only such story. In every other instance where we see, at least all the big famous ones, there's a cure. Jesus does something or says something, and the person is quote unquote healed, physically healed. They can walk again, they can see again, they can hear again, they stop bleeding. They're quote unquote sane again. But in this story, that's not what happens. She's not her profound joy and sense of the love of God does not come from being made normal. And I think, to me, that's a really interesting place to start when we talk about or think about disability um, as Christians, as any kind of spiritual people. And when we get into sort of the practical sort of nuts and bolts of talking about disability in the context of the pandemic. So I kind of wanted to start there. Um, oops, there we go. Sorry. Um, oh, also, I don't have a stand for my phone, and so sorry if it wobbles and moves around. So in terms of the pandemic, what I really want to focus on and emphasize is the way that the pandemic has been double-edged, maybe multi-edged, for disabled people. Because it's both created access in some weird and unexpected ways, and it's also ratcheted up ableism. So I think is the thing that we have to, again, also sort of keep in mind, is that there's an element and a level of paradox involved. And I say maybe multi-edged is a better way to think of it than double-edged, because that plays out differently for different people because of the way disability intersects with race and class and gender and immigration status and all of that. So the ways and the degrees um to which the pandemic, well, not so much the pandemic itself, but the policies taken in response to it, or the workarounds created in response to it, have sort of both created access and created greater ableism, greater discrimination. Before I get into that, though, and I didn't include this in the slide presentation, but I will tack it on the end or try to insert it. Is to define ableism. People may be familiar with that term or they may not. Um, it's typically, it's often, most commonly, I think it's fair to say, it's most commonly defined as discrimination against disabled people, prejudice against disabled people. I don't find that definition entirely useful, because it tends to focus on individual behavior and individual attitudes. And yes, that's certainly part of it. But as with so many other things, there's a systemic component to it as well. So I find it more useful to define ableism, and I'm not the first or the only to define it this way. In fact, I read a really brilliant phrasing of this recently that I can't remember where I read it, but I hope I can find it again. Thinking of ableism instead as a system which ranks the value of lives and bodies according to how well they measure up to, how closely they measure up to a certain standard of normalcy. And often that measuring, that quantifying is quite literal, in the case of things like IQ tests, etc. So that I find is a much more useful definition of ableism, and that's the way I tend to think about it. Because again, it gets to that systemic level rather than just focusing on individual people's behaviors and attitudes, because A, it's more than that, and B, of course, the systemic level influences the individual attitudes and behaviors. They don't exist in a vacuum. So first of all, I wanted to flag some ways that the pandemic, or rather sort of the measures taken in response to it, have actually created greater access in some areas and for some people. Because I think that's something that we don't often tend to think about in terms of the pandemic. We tend to think of how awful it is and how negatively it's impacted a lot of people. But there've been some interesting, I hesitate to say positive things that have come out of it, but that because that sounds kind of awful. But you know what I mean. So for example, particularly when so many things, work, school, leisure activities, types of performances went online, went on Zoom, that actually made things more accessible for a great many people, and in fact is an accommodation that disabled people had been lobbying for a very long time, and had sort of been told was too inconvenient, too whatever. But in fact, suddenly we did it for everybody during the pandemic, and wow. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. For one thing, perhaps the most obvious, if things are online, people don't have to travel. People don't have to, you know, deal with the vagaries of either public transit or paratransit, which are better than they used to be, but still can be, difficult for people with various kinds of mobility limitations. Assuming you qualify for paratransit, you may just be, bum out of luck and have to, hack it on the TTC. so, so that's kind of the obvious one. But sort of in less obvious ways, for example, um, work and everything going online meant that, for example, you can turn your camera off, mute your audio, and not have to suppress your tics or your physical disability, bodily quirks that you might have to spend a lot of energy trying to suppress out in the world, at the office, etc. You can also mute your audio, shut your camera off, and go attend to bodily needs as needed, which you might not be able to do out in the world or at the office. And also just be muted and have the camera off and sort of be more private, listen without having to interact, if that is a source of stress and anxiety, which it is for many people. Um, so those are sort of some ways. So those are sort of some ways in which moving so much of life and interaction online actually created greater access, on a personal note. I cannot tell you how much more often I've made it to church on time since it went on Zoom, since I don't have to travel. So since I didn't have to travel to get to mass on time. In another, in another way, for example, and this is a big one that one might not think of. When I started having to teach online, instead of doing in-person tutorials, it was great because I could, instead of having to try to interface with the tech in the lecture hall, to say run a slide presentation, etc., I could run it from my own computer or phone that's configured with my accessibility settings. So, and I know, that's probably true for many other people too. So those are some ways that, in fact, the shift online in response to the pandemic actually increased access in some areas, in some ways, and for some people. Now, it's come with its own challenges. How is the Zoom automatic subtitle generator doing accurately recording what I'm saying? I've been in some webinars where it's been very interesting. And yeah, so that And of course, for some people, you know, just as for some people, sort of being out in public in a environment or traveling on public transit, etc., can be very overstimulating and, kind of overload. For some people, the reverse is true, and having to, stare at or listen to a screen for hours, particularly sort of the way screens, the light register of screens and the way they flicker can be a problem, for some people. So it's so as I said, it's the move online did create greater access, but I do have to emphasize that it's not universal. It didn't do so for everybody. And there's still a lot of there's still a lot of improvements that could be made. And another way in which the pandemic kind of very perversely improved things was that at least some disabled people got a bit of financial relief, a bit. For example, there was talk, I can't remember if they actually did it, but there was some talk of at the height of the pandemic, I think summer of 2020, raising ODSP to $2,000. So that did provide, just as they were doing like CERB and all that other stuff. So some people did get some financial relief, and there were similar packages in other jurisdictions. But this is where we begin to get into the ways in which the pandemic was double-edged. Because, of course, as you might imagine, all these things did not apply to everyone. I've already covered some of the ways in which, just as Zoom created greater access, it also comes with its own access challenges. The same thing with those bits of financial relief. First of all, especially if you live in Toronto, $2,000 a month is not enough. That's barely rent. And also, as those of you who've ever been on ODSP will know, it doesn't include specific coverage, for high-speed internet. And of course, Zoom only works well if you have quite good high-speed internet, quite good access to broadband, which lots of people, including people with disabilities who are low income, do not. And it's sort of a weird irony. While some of us do get assistance paying for assistive devices, you don't get assistance paying with the broadband to keep them connected. So that was definitely one. So that's one way in which it was very double-edged. And of course, the financial relief only, that assumes you qualify for it, right? That assumes you qualify for ODSP, which not everyone who experiences disability does. Because, as those of you who've been through that know, you not only have to have a formal diagnosis, which not all disabled people do, for lots of reasons having to do with, access to healthcare, immigration status, and even your type of disability. For example, people in chronic illness, neurodiversity communities, etc., often wait years, even decades, for a diagnosis. And without that, you can't qualify for ODSP. But even on top of that, it has its own assessment process to see if you're, to borrow an expression from the Victorian era, the deserving poor, to assess whether your ability to work is impacted enough so that you quote unquote really need it. So yeah, there was financial relief, but not for everybody. It giveth and it taketh away. But then the bigger double edge, the nastier part of the double edge, was felt in some of the public health measures that were taken in response to the pandemic, or maybe it's better said, the public health half measures. um, because I have read many of my disabled colleagues, have felt that these were actively discriminatory, and in fact, I have frankly seen the word eugenics used a lot. Because first of all, and I'm getting out of order with what I wanted to say, and that's scrambling my brain. Oops. But basically, yeah. So first of all, ways that were problematic. So first of all, the assessment of COVID itself, the assessment of the level of how dangerous the virus was, because it was often assessed as sort of not all that dangerous because it primarily caused, severe illness or death in quote unquote people with pre-existing conditions, elderly and disabled people, and didn't seem um didn't seem to be that dangerous to the hale and hearty. And that assessment affected a whole bunch of other policy choices. For example, incomplete lockdowns that allowed the virus to keep spreading, including, putting in danger those who were most vulnerable to it, i.e., people with pre-existing conditions. Incomplete mask mandates and the politicization. This is probably the one we think of the most when we think about the way the pandemic has impacted disabled people, is, incomplete mask mandates and the politicization of masking, and the refusal by so many people to wear masks, and their attempt to sort of bully other people into not wearing masks, which of course not only caused further spread of the virus, and that's well documented, but also, at least if Twitter feeds are anything to go by, was very directly felt by a lot of disabled people as not just a slap in the face, but we don't care if you die. And then, of course, the one that had a lot of disabled people really concerned, back at the beginning of the pandemic, and it's, still true, was, I guess I would say, sort of triage policies, rationing of healthcare, rationing of COVID care, because disabled people felt and knew that, like elderly people, they would not be prioritized. It was fairly common. I think it's safe to say very common, even pre-pandemic, um, for people with various kinds of disabilities to have doctors put a "do not resuscitate" note on their charts without their consent. It might be added sometimes. And so when people began, when these healthcare rationing policies came in, and in fairness, well, not exactly in fairness, because there should never have been that severe a shortage of, of the supplies we needed. That's a whole other conversation about, neoliberalism and just to the minute production, and why the heck do we not have stockpiles of these things. But I want to be clear that nobody is disputing the genuineness of the shortages. Like, yeah, no, the shortages were real. They were very real. There was just very deep concern. Well, deep concern, outrage, and anger among disabled people that the way that was sort of being handled was in some ways battlefield triage. Treat the people who were seen as having the highest value, i.e., the young, the hale and hearty, i.e., those who are still able to work, versus the elderly, the disabled, people who are seen as having less value because they're not quote unquote productive. That I think was the biggest. um yeah, that I think was the biggest. That was the biggest, I think, scary side of the pandemic for a lot of disabled people. Quite apart from vulnerability to, quite apart from, their actual vulnerability to COVID. Um, and of course, the above mentioned shortages, of medical supplies, of masks, of lots of other kind of things, impacted lots of disabled people too, because of being low income, because of not having mobility, because of like having trouble accessing those things anyway, even when they weren't, even when there weren't shortages. And of course, it's really important to keep in mind that different disabled people were impacted differently by all this. So, for example, um, when I first got invited to do this workshop, I have to admit I had some hesitation about whether it was appropriate for me to do it. Because, for example, as a white, highly educated, relatively, I wouldn't say affluent, but certainly not in as dire poverty as many disabled people, with relatively good employment. I was a teaching assistant when the pandemic started. I've now been downgraded to a marker grader, but it's still, it still pays a lot better than minimum wage, you know, and has quite good benefits because we have a very strong union, so I'm in a position of relative privilege, and as such, my experience of the pandemic was relatively mild. Yes, we did have to kind of stay in the house for a year. Um, and yes, that got a little bit, you know, squirrely after a while because intense cabin fever and sort of, okay, oh my good heavens, when will this crazy isolation end? Um, at first I love being online because yay, I don't have to travel, because that's something that's very difficult for me. But after a year, almost two, is kind of like, okay, even I actually, you know, miss being in person with people, as difficult as that is. But that is nothing compared to the hardships that many disabled people of color experience, who are in much more dire poverty, many indigenous disabled people who are dealing with colonization and the conditions on reserves that existed before the pandemic. um you know Unhoused disabled people, which there are a lot of, which that's a very common thing. So, um and of course, it's all impacted by immigration status too, because if you don't have immigration status, then forget about ODSP. Forget about any of that stuff. You can't access it. So it's really important to remember that I've sort of given the broad strokes of the ways that the pandemic impacted disabled people for good and for good, bad, and ugly. But, there's a lot more nuance to it as it intersects with race and class and gender, and, queerness and housing and, all those other things that impact people's lives. Because, of course, I love this wonderful line from Audre Lorde. I forget how it begins, but it's like, we can't have a single issue politics because we don't live single issue lives. And that's absolutely true. I mean, it's, yes, you're disabled, and your disability impacts the way you experience all those other things too. My experience in the pandemic, in, white privilege, all that, yes, but it's still different from that of a non-disabled person. But at the same time, all those other things inflect disability as well. Meaning, as I said, that, my experience of the pandemic was, for example, much more, much kinder in some ways. And it also, of course, depends on what kind of disability you have. People with different kinds of disabilities were impacted very differently. People with mobility versus like neuromuscular and respiratory issues had very different issues and experiences than I did, for example. So I mean, whole books could probably be written, and probably are being written. I certainly hope that they are, in fact, being written, on, the nuances of the many different ways that the pandemic impacted different disabled people, at different intersections. So let me just check the time. Woo, okay, it's 1:42. Sorry, screen reader chattering away. Whenever I tap the clock to tell me what time it is, it says a whole bunch of other stuff as well. That's annoying. Yeah. So I talked a bit longer than I meant to. I hope that it was informative and thought provoking and not repetitive and boring. And even then, that kind of only scratches the surface, really, as much as there is in there, that kind of only scratches the surface. But now, for the last sort of half hour or so of the session, I think we're supposed to go till 2:15. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
I'd love to sort of open the floor for discussion and thoughts and questions, and particularly, as I said, to sort of think about how this all plays out or applies or can be applied in our local contexts of our parishes, etc.
Yeah. So, oh, I see a hand. I'm going to ask my question first, if I can.
Yeah,
if that's
sure.
okay. Yeah. And then go to Dwayne. So one of the things that you referenced is, online church as one of the things that a lot of people have developed. And that's something I'm interested in as a pastor as well. Can you say a bit about what are some of the features that make online church a more accessible space in your experience, or in the experience of people that you're hearing from?
Well, in my experience, the big one was not having to travel to get to church, because I hope that, the next time I'm in a major city, I will qualify for their paratransit, but I have not historically been on it, because the one time I tried back in the aughts, I didn't qualify because they thought I was too mobile. And that is a thing that happens, by the way.
Right.
And so for me, the big thing was, so for me, the big thing was not having to travel, not having to sort of brave the TTC. Just don't get me wrong, I'm very pro public transit, but navigating it as a disabled person can be a bit of a how can I say this sans four-letter words? Yeah, it can fry your brain a bit. I
Mm,
you know, and because like for me, it's not so much a blind issue, but it's a neurodiversity issue because it's loud and crowded and very complex. It can be a bit of overload. So especially early in the morning. So and so for me that was the biggest thing, was not yeah, was not having to travel. But also I think I can well imagine, and interesting, a lot of the disabled folks that I follow and that I've been hearing from um aren't aren't church folks, aren't Christians. I they may or may not have their own spiritual and religious practices, but that's not one of them. So I haven't heard much about that from other people. But yeah, that was definitely my experience. And also, as I said, not so much in church, because St. Stephen's is honestly pretty chill about um, kind of taking in anything, not exactly in anything goes, but a kind of a stuff happens approach to what happens during service. But in other contexts, as I said, it's really nice to be able to um, you know, turn the camera off, mute my audio, sort of not worry about whether I'm, you know, dressed appropriately, sort of looking appropriate, whether my face is doing weird things, which it sometimes does when I lose concentration. Um, whether I'm doing other sort of neurodiversity tics you know, that I try not to when in public, those kind of things too.
mm. That's really helpful. Thank you. Those are both
Hmm.
really great points.
But I should say, the way we do church at online church at St. Stephen's, we actually do it as a live Zoom call. So we didn't just, and I say this because I know not all churches did this. Some just sort of filmed mass in a presumably empty or sparsely populated church and streamed it. We actually did ours as a live Zoom call, not usually from the church itself, but usually from Mother Maggie's home office. And so there was still that level of interactivity. We weren't all able to take live communion, which I know was really hard on a lot of people, but we did still have some level of interactivity, which I think helped, at least for me, because it didn't feel totally sort of cut off and like just watching something on TV or something like that.
Gotcha. Thank you. Yeah. Dwayne, you had your hand up, so I'll pass to you.
Hi, I just want to say, just amazing talk, and it's actually great. I've been sitting, I don't think, oh yeah, I had this experience, just
Mm,
um, because my disability is, I'm gonna say, like, I have OCD, so very severe
mhm.
obsessive compulsive disorder, and as you were saying, a huge issue is just getting anywhere on time, and so having access to things online, especially in church specifically, because I wasn't able to go for
Mm,
years. So I would have to, so just having it online and being able to literally just turn on the phone and okay, that's it. I'm there. I can, and as you were saying, have the camera off, so I don't have to, what do I look like, that type of thing. It increased my participation, 500-fold. I mean, I
yeah,
went from not having been there for years to being there every single week.
yeah.
Um,
Oh, same here, same here, same here.
and it's actually really funny because specifically with OCD, one of my issues, as you would imagine, has always been, germs and et cetera, and contamination, et cetera. And so I've always, so even prior to the pandemic, I would, very discreetly sit, away from people, and I wouldn't touch things, and I would travel at, at odd hours. And
Yep.
so when everybody started doing that all of a sudden, I just had this moment, this wonderful year-long period of just sort of feeling sane, just feeling like everybody else. And then when they started to sort of lower the lower the restrictions, it was almost depressing for me in a way, because I thought, oh well, now I'm suddenly back to being the odd one out again.
I've heard that from a lot of people that I follow who are like, yeah, we're still taking all the precautions.
Yeah. Yeah, that is exactly, and something else that you said too, with the almost like the eugenics, thing. Well, a lot of the discussions that, as you were saying, happen. People would just say, "Oh, well, it's only for people who have pre-existing conditions," as though it's sort of, as you said, like as though like people with pre-existing conditions are less worthy of life, but also almost in this way as if that they've done something to deserve like as in the, like pre-existing condition, as if it's something that they have done to like, well, it's their fault they have those conditions, and it therefore they have removed themselves from being worthy of consideration. Because I mean, my disability is not physical at all, but for somebody who has diabetes, for somebody who has any sort of physical disability, that's just what they have, right?
Oh, absolutely. And particularly for things like, type 2 diabetes, obesity, things that are considered sort of quote unquote lifestyle,
Yeah.
related impairments. Yeah, there is absolutely that kind of shadow behind the discourse. Yeah.
And yeah, and it's just this underlying thing, this underlying sentiment, as you said, it was just and again, and sort of like when you're looking at things like mask mandates and how they were politicized, and I mean, people are saying, oh, my freedom, etc. And when you're weighing somebody's life versus putting on like a stupid little mask for, what I mean, for like for two, it's not, it's not really that big of a deal, but people are saying, well, my desire to not wear a mask is more important than someone's life who has a pre-existing condition, who has, as you said, like diabetes, has breathing problems,
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was a lot of the sort of sentiment that I was seeing, and certainly online. The disabled folks I follow online was feeling that, oh great, well, I guess we know how you feel about us. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
But thank you.
Mhm.
I see Sheila's hand is up, so I'll pass to Sheila.
Hi. I can just say, from a hearing impaired person, it was absolute hell on earth.
Oh, I can believe that. Yeah.
Terrible having to deal with masks. I have a copy.
Oh God, yeah.
I'm sorry?
I said, oh God, yeah, because they make lip reading impossible.
Yeah, you didn't mention that. There's an awful lot of hearing impaired people. It's probably the biggest disability. And it's one of the fastest growing demographics because of many, many reasons. So it affected a great many people. And many people found out for the first time that they were hearing impaired. They suddenly didn't realize that they needed to see someone's face. They were subconsciously reading lips, but they didn't even know. And I have a cochlear implant, which is held on with a magnet. The implant is under my skull, and the magnet holds it on, and it's not very secure. So fiddling around with masks and all of this fumbling with it became very, very difficult to handle. I went taken to hospital in an ambulance, and I was conscious when I went in, but I became unconscious in the ER. When I woke up, they'd taken all my clothes off and pulled it off, and it was gone forever.
Oh, shit.
So I spent nearly 3 weeks in hospital, totally profoundly deaf, which I hadn't been for 15 years because I've had the implant.
Right.
I mean, I couldn't hear a bomb go off during that whole time, I never once met a doctor or nurse who understood. I kept saying, I need you to write this, write it down. And they'd whisper in my ear or yell at me or something.
Oh, geez.
Finally, there's only one hospital in Toronto that does the implants for adults. There's only three in Ontario.
Wow.
So I needed to get a loaner until I could get a new one, which, by the way, I have to pay for. It's not covered by OHIP.
What?
No, being able to hear is not considered important under OHIP. I had to pay nearly $6,000.
Holy shit. It's not covered by the assistive devices program?
And it's not covered by insurance either, because my company has
wow.
insurance. They cover
Jesus
500
mercy.
over 3 years. So
Oh, that's absurd.
yeah, if you can't afford it, then you just spend the rest of your life in silence. So I got a loaner from Sunnybrook, which is the hospital here that did the surgery on me. And they wanted it back in a month. That was in February of 2001.
Yeah, no, that's not
I
going to
refused
work.
to give it back because I literally couldn't hear a bomb go off without it. So
Oh, boy.
I finally got the replacement, which, as I said, I had to pay for. It's actually $10,000. There is some of it is covered.
Oh,
But
good.
and the hospital took no responsibility. They didn't even know what I was talking about. They didn't know what a cochlear implant was.
What?
And so I finally got the new one, because the loaner didn't really fit right, and it was always not working very well. So that was in May of this year. That's how long it took to get across the border
Wow.
to the United States. And it got lost on the way through Tennessee somewhere.
Wait,
So,
they had to order it from the States?
But yes, because we don't manufacture anything in Canada. But, like I was number one on the list of people, but all of the systems shut down. The Canadian Hearing Society, all of these things, if your hearing aid broke or you needed one or something like that, you just did without it because they shut down during the pandemic. There was no services for people with disabilities of any kind. I know more about hearing impairment than others, but I know it applies to many other people too. Things just shut down. And also, I think you were off a little bit on how much people get under Ontario disability. I believe it's about $1,200.
Oh yeah, it is now. There was some talk, I think, in the summer.
For one time only, something like 500 or something. But there's someone who, okay, if they lost their job because of the pandemic, they got $2,000 a month. But a lot of those people quit their jobs because they didn't want the risk or whatever. And I know people who weren't even employed who were getting it. There was a lot of fraud in it. So there was someone who could work, was getting $2,000 a month, and there's someone who's disabled getting $1,200. And anything to do with Zoom. Okay, my particular church has a very techie group of people. They're mostly immigrants from India. They're very high level computer engineers. So we had good captions on our Zoom.
Oh, nice.
But most churches, even the cathedral, I don't think is still doing it. And I had to ask to get them for this conference. I pursued that for years and years. I got into almost fights, but I worked to try to get captions on different things to do with the diocese. The last live synod meeting was live stream caption. And it was amazing because people who never found that they'd ever looked at captions before actually were looking at them. And because they benefit so many other issues besides just hearing impairment. People with all kinds of cognitive issues, even people who English is not their first language. So I would say that it definitely has not been a benefit, and I can't really get my head around the idea that it helped anybody with a disability. because everyone I know struggled because of the services not being provided.
Well, okay, first of all, I thank you very much for bringing up like the issue of the way that masks impacted people with hearing issues. I should have included that, and thank you so much for, because yeah, that was an absolute big thing, and the way that like in-person services shut down. Yeah, you're absolutely right to bring that up. That was a problem for a great many people. Yeah, no, it is true, and as I said, that's why I emphasize that yes, this shift to Zoom did, and this was not just my experience. I heard this from a lot of people I follow online too. It did create, greater access for some people, but absolutely not for everybody. And yeah, the as I said, I don't even remember if they actually did increase ODSP or just talked about it. But even if they did, yeah, it was temporary. It was supposed to be quote unquote
I
only
think
for
they
the
did it once.
duration.
That was
Yeah,
a time payment.
yeah, it was one of
They
those things that was
certainly
supposed to be
didn't
like,
do it at the time that the other people were getting 2,000 a month.
yeah, no, so it was temporary, and then it went, and then it reverted back to the, and then it reverted back to the old ODSP rate, which is, absolutely not.
Yeah, I
Oh,
mean, people can't live on that.
and that, I mean, that was true with a lot of the financial aid, not just for disability, but that came with the pandemic, and that it was temporary and supposed to be only for the duration of the pandemic, and then would be sort of revoked, canceled, once things went back to quote unquote normal. So that's been a huge problem for in a lot of quarters.
Can I ask a second question?
Yeah.
So one of the things that I noted down as you were speaking was you referenced incomplete lockdowns and incomplete mask mandates. That concept of something being incomplete, I thought was very interesting, because I feel like some of the attempts to correct the issues around the pandemic and things like that, as Ontario is considering coming out of the pandemic, or kind of looking in that direction, as people are trying to get so-called back to so-called normal.
Yeah.
I feel like that sense of incompleteness is still there. And I'm kind of wondering if you have any advice about how to influence conversations, how to influence
Well,
do you know what I mean? Like towards, okay, how do we make some permanent changes, some permanent complete changes to the way that we do things?
what I meant about like incomplete, incomplete lockdowns, incomplete, maybe the word I should have used is inconsistent, because for example, back in the early days of the pandemic, when we actually had a chance of, stopping the virus, that cat is out of the bag now. I don't think, and I've heard this from a lot of quarters, it's endemic now. It's not going anywhere. We lost that chance. But back when we had it, there was a lot of concern about like, we said we were shutting down everything except essential services, except we then kept not doing it. We kept leaving certain sectors exempt to keep the economy going, etc., and that allowed the virus to keep spreading. And then similar things with mask mandates, those were better, at least in Toronto, at least in Ontario, but you don't have to wear them outdoors, you don't have to wear them in a gathering of less than, and so that lost us the chance to really shut the virus down, back when we had it. That's more what I was sort of referring to, but I see what you mean too about the feeling of, and I think that's a question a lot of people are asking. Okay, we lost that chance, we let the cat out of the bag, now there are variants, left, right, center, and upside down and backwards. And they're probably, gonna be with us for a while. And yeah, nobody kind of seems to know what to do about it. Everybody seems to be sort of throwing up their hands and going, well, I guess we'll just get back to normal and hope for the best. Except for those people and jurisdictions who are still, persisting in masking, persisting in social distancing. And yeah, I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names. The person before me's comments, I wanted to circle back and say, like, with the doing church online, that was another interesting area where it sort of both created access and didn't, because as I said, it was wonderful for me because I didn't have to travel. And it kept that still level of some interactivity. But back when we weren't doing in-person services, which we weren't for a long time, we have gone back to having scaled down still in-person services now, but of course for most of 2020 and 2021 we pretty much weren't. But that also shut out other members, that kept many of us able to participate, but it also shut out other members of our congregation who either didn't have access to broadband because of low income, or who just weren't comfortable with the technology. So like that was a problem too.
So I'll just note we have about 7 minutes left, and I saw Dwayne and Sheila both raise their hands. Dwayne, do you want to go first and then pass to Sheila?
Oh, sure. Yeah, just one quick, but you already you actually already brought the point I was going to make, so it's fine. Yeah, because I was going to say, yeah, with the access, it was great for me personally, but then again, there's so many elderly people at our church, and as you said, they're not comfortable with the technology, or they don't have and they had to go on the phones, and so yeah, so as you said, double-edged sword.
Yeah. Yeah, we had some people who phoned into the Zoom calls, but we had some people who weren't even comfortable doing that or didn't have a smartphone. They had believe it or not, an old-fashioned landline. And so, you can't phone into Zoom on that.
Sheila, would you like to go?
I just wanted to say that when you were talking about other groups that perhaps had much more negative experiences, certainly that is a factor. Anyone, for example, Indigenous people have a very high percentage of hearing impairment. If you were in a remote area, that opportunity, I know someone who had a cochlear implant on a reserve up north, and they would bring them down by ambulance each time for treatment.
Oh, wow.
That just became totally impossible during the pandemic.
Oh, yeah.
Because and so all of this, it all connects. Everything connects. And that was what we were saying with the thing with the prison. I mean, there's huge percentages of people in prison who have hearing impairments. Many people in prison have tuberculosis. The treatment they give for that actually can cause hearing impairment. But someone who is incarcerated in prison is not going to get an audiologist to go in there and help them and give them a hearing aid. So you've got a massive number of people who just are not getting any help. They're not getting it anyways, but during the pandemic, it became worse.
Absolutely. And of course, also lots of Indigenous and remote communities don't have access to broadband either, because of poverty and digital divide issues and the way the service is distributed. So yeah, that's a thing too.
See, Sharon, you have your hand up, and then I think Sarah, Eric, you might want to think about wrapping up just for the time.
Just had to get it off of mute. A couple of things. I really appreciated today because, as I told Peter before, I'm ill, and so I couldn't have gone to Toronto to a conference, but being able to do it via Zoom, which made me think more too about people in our congregation, and I think of one woman in particular. She does drive, but to get to Toronto, it takes too much energy,
Mhm.
right? Her own personal energy, but also the cost of the gas and
Mhm.
all of that sort of thing. So
Oh God, yeah.
yeah, so I'm kind of really hoping that as the diocese has these events and they go back to in person, that they'll still be able to have some form of Zoom where people can join in, because I think that's important. You made me think of one other thing. I'm involved in a nonprofit housing apartment building, and we provide internet, but
Oh
I don't
wow.
know whether it's high speed or not. Like, just because you brought up the idea of high speed internet, I thought, I guess that's something I need to go and check. Because
Oh yeah, yeah, because a lot of things do not work very well, including Zoom. Yeah, if
Mhm.
you do not have good quality broadband, it just won't. It's better if you do it without the video on, but it can still.
Still
But yeah,
disconnect.
there's limits on that. And thank you for reminding me, because one of the things I wanted to sort of flag was that is true. Like, one of the things I've been sort of seeing on disability Twitter and Facebook a lot is that, like, yeah, as things have started to quote unquote get back to normal, a lot of things that sort of had gone online during the pandemic, they're rushing to get back in person and they're dropping their online options. And that is creating a problem. And I mean, I'm glad things are getting back to in person, if and to the extent that it can be done safely, because as I think Sheila, I'm terrible with names, was saying, like, that is better and more accessible for many people. But also many people are alarmed that, in the rush to sort of open everything back up and get things back in person, the online, the online option is being sort of dropped as, I guess, people are sort of thinking of it as sort of an ugly vestige of the pandemic. Oh God, and now we're starting to get the attitude of, oh well, that's just an extra, that's just an extra. We don't really need to do that, and that's sad, because it's starting to make things inaccessible for other people,
Exactly.
for other people again. So yeah, I absolutely agree with you that it's one of the practical things we can do is really try our best to keep, the online option available as well, exactly for that, for people who can't travel or who can't be there in person, for whom that doesn't work, because yeah, that's not going anywhere for a
No.
lot of
Thank you.
for a lot of folks.
May I clarify, please?
Yeah.
Actually, online, as in YouTube or various other methods, is not synonymous with Zoom. Zoom is interactive, as we know. That's why I'm talking to you.
Mhm.
And you can dial into Zoom from a landline phone.
You can? I
You
did not know
can.
that.
We have
Interesting.
several people in our parish who do, and we buddy with them to make sure I run over and take them the email copies of stuff they need. But you can phone
wow.
in by landline phone. And you can't do that on YouTube or the other online things.
Yeah, no, you
So
can't.
we
Yeah.
do Zoom services, and we also record the service. So
Mhm.
real-time interactive, you can Zoom. Later on, you can go back and see the recording. And then for people who want to be in person, since we're allowed to be in person now, but still
Mhm.
have a degree of caution, the 8 o'clock service has been mandatory, totally masked, no matter what anybody says.
Mhm.
So people who want to feel safe can go to the little 8 o'clock service, fewer people, less crowded, for sure mask.
Mhm.
So it's just a matter of having various options.
Absolutely. And I'm using Zoom as a kind of a shorthand, partly because, like, it's kind of dominated from going to a program that very few people outside the corporate world had ever even heard of before the pandemic. It's kind of gone from that to kind of dominating the world of sort of online meetings, online events, etc. in a very short period of time. But you're absolutely right. It is certainly not the only online platform that people have done and attempted to provide things on. And yeah, it does have some differences from those others. Absolutely. And thank you. I did not know you could dial into Zoom from a landline. That's cool and interesting to note. Yeah, we do that too. We have both a Zoom service and an in-person service now, but of course the in-person service is still, masks required, social distancing, and no congregational singing either, which is sad but necessary for now. Did one last person have
ahead.
their hand?
I'm very sorry to interrupt, Sarah. It's been great hearing you and getting to spend this time with you. It's Elizabeth.
Yeah.
But one small point of clarification. I believe the person you are thinking of uses a rotary phone, which was the issue, that they couldn't phone in using a rotary phone because it doesn't release the dial
No.
tone. So.
Okay, thank you. That does clarify things, because I knew there was some technical reason to do with their phone that they hadn't been able to dial into Zoom. And you're right, I remember that now. It's because they actually have an old-fashioned rotary phone that Zoom can't recognize because you're right, with a touch tone, it'll still recognize the number presses, even if it's a landline, but not with an old-fashioned rotary, which, yeah. I mean, people don't think about that, because one thinks about who has an old-fashioned rotary phone anymore, but yeah, apparently some people still do. So anyway, it is now, oh my goodness, it is now 2:17, so we're a couple of minutes over time. Oh, for heaven's sakes, screen reader, be quiet. It's helpful, but it also tends to jabber on annoyingly. Yeah, so we're a couple minutes over time now. Thank you very much all for being, for having such a lively and engaged discussion. And I hope this has all been useful and interesting to think about, and and has given folks things to think about when sort of going back to your own church and neighborhood and town, if you're sort of outside of main Toronto contexts. Yeah, thank you all very much for coming. Thank the conference and the Social Justice and Advocacy Committee, I think that's the word, so much again for having me. It's been an enormous honor and privilege, and I was really glad and honored and humbled to be able to come and give at least sort of my perspective and my experience and the experience of the people I sort of the disability activists I follow on this. And thank you all for sharing yours as well. That was wonderful and really engaging, and I learned stuff I didn't know, so thank you all for that. And how much time do we have before the closing thing, Peter?
That's a good question. I think we're coming back in about at 2:45, I think is the closing.
Okay, excellent. So we all have time to go refresh ourselves, get coffee, etc. Excellent.
On behalf of all of us, thank you so much for sharing with us. And I just want to, I guess, echo what you said. This has been a very helpful space for me. I've learned a lot, and I can already think of a few places where I'm going to be repeating elements of this conversation within my own church community. So thank you to you, Sarah, Eric, for leading the conversation, and to all the other folks who offered parts of their experience too. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I just want to reiterate again, I'm going to be sending my slide presentation, which is basically a summary of what I talked about, although with less details. It's sort of a point form, sort of Cole's Notes version. I'll be sending that to Elin later to send around to you all, and also a kind of a resource sheet that has a bunch of books and websites and Twitter feeds that people can check out if you're, want to sort of dive further into this and get more information. So hopefully I will get to that tonight or tomorrow, but yeah, look out for that, and hopefully she'll be able to send, Elin will be able to send that out to all of you. So yeah, look out for that in your inboxes.
Thank you so much. I'll just note a number of people are giving their thanks in the chat as well. Informative, helpful. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. Oh, I'm
there.
glad it was.
All right.
All
Blessings,
right.
everyone. Thank you
Mhm.
so much. Be well.